You wake up to the gentle sound of sheep farting nearby. It's still dark outside, though the rooster has decided that your ears didn't deserve peace this morning. Again, your bed smells like the inside of a damp boot. There's ace stuck in your armpits. And your head is resting on what is definitely not a pillow. It's just a sack of something vaguely flour-like but mostly lumpy. Your mouth tastes like someone whispered onion at it from across the village. Welcome to your life, a muddy, unwashed smear of 11th century peasantry. You sit up, slowly, because your back is about as stiff as your social mobility. And you remember, you were supposed to help gather firewood today. Again, because stories don't tell themselves, and neither do fires. Not unless you're rich, which you're not. You're very not. But before you throw that itchy wool blanket off and stumble out into the gloriously damp morning mist, do me a favor. If you've been enjoying these weirdly specific time travel hallucinations I keep dragging you into, consider clicking like and subscribing to this channel. Only if you want more of this nonsense, of course. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is. Because I'm always fascinated by which time zones are collectively deciding to fall asleep to the smell of medieval sweat and vague despair. Now, let's get you through the day. And more importantly, let's talk about the only real entertainment you've got in this world. No Netflix. No podcasts. No cat memes. Just your ears, your eyes, and the one neighbor who swears he saw a dragon once, but also thinks soup is a government conspiracy. We're talking oral storytelling. Welcome to the only narrative medium available when literacy was about as common as unicorn sightings. It's not like you could read anything anyway. You, like about 90% of people in medieval Europe, can't even sign your name. And not in a cool, rebellious way, more in a what's a letter kind of way. You've seen writing before, maybe, on a church wall, in a book once, held by a monk with mysterious smells and even more mysterious celibacy. But the squiggly lines may as well be spells. Not the cool kind. Just incomprehensible Latin that may or may not say, please return by Easter or pay a fine. So how did you learn anything? How did you know about the brave knight who once stabbed a giant in the kneecap? Or the maiden who turned into a tree because she refused to marry a goat farmer? Stories. Spoken ones. Long ones. Exaggerated ones. Sometimes sung. Sometimes whispered over campfires or told under the guise of cautionary tales involving immoral behavior and sudden, ironic death. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was everything. It was how history survived, how gossip thrived, how legends were born, how local drama was dressed up in enough metaphor to avoid getting you set on fire for treason. Because let's face it, everyone loves a scandal. Especially when you pretend it happened far, far away, to someone else. And it all starts at the hearth. The flickering fire. The kids picking fleas out of each other's hair. The parents pretending the damp ceiling isn't leaking again. The village elder, or maybe just the one guy with a good voice and not too much phlegm that day, clears his throat. And with a dramatic pause that probably means he forgot the beginning again, he starts. Once upon a time, though not actually those words, because this is a bit before once upon a time was trendy, there was a hero, or a villain, or someone suspiciously similar to your neighbor. And the story unfolds, not in perfect logic or literary elegance, but with rhythm, exaggeration, and dramatic hand movements that may or may not involve miming battle axes. You see, medieval storytelling wasn't about accuracy. It was about vibe. If it made the crowd laugh, gasp, or soil their collective underpants in terror, it was a good story. Truth was optional. Entertainment was mandatory. Especially since your other entertainment option is counting rats. The best storytellers, whether they were bards, minstrels, traveling troubadours, or just that one woman who could make a flatbread seem mysterious, they knew how to keep an audience spellbound. They weren't reading from a script. They were performing, improvising, shifting details based on who was listening. If the Lord's cousin was in town, suddenly the villain had a suspiciously similar nose. If someone's husband had just run off with the blacksmith, maybe a new tale appeared about loyalty and what happened when you crossed the forge without permission. The magic of it all? These stories traveled. One tale born in the icy northern fjords could find its way into the sun-baked villages of Italy within a generation. Carried not by scrolls or royal messengers, but by song, by gossip, by that one merchant who heard it in a tavern and decided it'd help him haggle better next time. But let's rewind a bit. Let's go back to the first place you ever heard a story. You're 6. Your nose is runny. You've just tripped over a pig. Again. And your mother, tired, muddy, and unimpressed, sits you down beside the fire and begins, in that tired voice that says, "I've told this tale 100 times, but here we go again, the story of the girl who sang to the moon and turned her enemies into geese." You don't remember the words exactly, but you remember the feeling, the warmth of the fire, the flicker of shadows on the wall, the way your sister fell asleep with her face in a turnip. You remember laughing when the goose flew into the chimney. You remember the way your mother's voice dropped to a whisper when the evil duke came near. And that was the story. That was the magic. Not the words. Not the facts. The feeling. You take that story with you. You tell it to your own child. Someday, even though you'll accidentally make the goose a duck and forget why the moon was involved in the first place. But the tale lives on, in some weird, mutated way. Like folklore telephone. And that's how stories survived when no one could write them down. Like viral TikToks made of words and breath and communal boredom. But of course, not all storytelling was casual fireside stuff. Some people did it for a living. Enter the minstrel, the bard, the jongler. Think of them as Spotify, live, and usually slightly drunk. These were the professional storytellers, the medieval equivalents of your favorite podcasters, except with fewer microphones and more stringed instruments they probably couldn't tune. They traveled from village to village, telling tales, singing songs, and occasionally making wildly inappropriate jokes that would definitely get them canceled today. They recited epic poems, spun tales of love and bloodshed, and played weird harp things that made exactly one good sound and 17 awful ones. Some even memorized entire chansons de geste, epic tales of heroism, knightly valor, and incredibly impractical quests. These weren't short little bedtime stories. We're talking hours, sometimes days. Audiences would gather and sit through all of it, mostly because there was literally nothing else to do. Also, if you left early, the storyteller might improvise a bit and make your family the butt of the next tale. And you don't want to be known as the guy who got eaten by a talking cow. The best performers had a sense for the crowd. If they noticed too many drooping eyelids, they'd throw in a chase scene, a surprise dragon, a comically large sausage, whatever worked. And sure, sometimes they repeated themselves, or forgot half the plot, or added a cousin who definitely wasn't in the story last time. But no one cared, because storytelling was a living thing, fluid, flexible, occasionally drunk. And then there was the church. Ah yes, the church. That great medieval content moderator. The spiritual YouTube comment section. They had their own stories to tell, ones with moral lessons, severe consequences, and at least one saint getting boiled alive. They told tales and sermons, in stained glass, in haunting Gregorian chants that all sounded like someone accidentally pressed the minor key button and never turned it off. Stories from the Bible, stories of martyrs, stories of how being horny would inevitably lead to eternal damnation. Fun stuff. But those tales stuck too. Why? Because they were told, performed, embellished, and because fear, as it turns out, is one of the most effective storytelling tools in the human arsenal. Right next to fire, wine, and a captive audience stuck inside during a plague. Sometimes, the stories merged. Pagan tales blended with Christian saints. Ancient legends got baptized. Folk heroes got halos. Robin Hood robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. Sure, but depending on who was telling it, he also might have healed lepers and sung Mass on Sundays. Why not? Because in the medieval world, storytelling wasn't about documentation. It was about survival. Cultural survival. Emotional survival. Literal keep your kids quiet until bedtime survival. It kept people connected. It explained the unexplainable. It gave shape to things like justice, love, betrayal, and why your neighbor's cow looks at you funny. And it all happened without a single page being turned. Your job? Remember the stories. Pass them on. Tell them badly if you must, but tell them. You won't live long. You'll get 35 good years if you're lucky and don't get dysentery from that well again. But your stories? They might outlive you. They might travel. They might even end up in some future video like this one, listened to by someone in 2025 trying to fall asleep. And on that note, the fire's crackling lower. The sheep have stopped making eye contact. And your blanket, still itchy, now smells faintly of roasted beetroot. It's time to rest. But the stories? They'll be back tomorrow. Unless you want to hear one now. You wake up again. Somehow. Miraculously. The sun is stabbing you directly in the eyeballs like it holds a personal grudge. Your head hurts, but not from wine. You couldn't afford wine. It's probably dehydration. Or the mold on your ceiling gaining sentience. Either way, welcome back. You sit up and the floor creaks like it wants to report you to the village council. The air smells like last night's turnip stew, and possibly something dead under the floorboards. Could be a rat. Could be hope. Either way, it's not getting cleaned up anytime soon. You stretch. Your bones pop like twigs underfoot. And you remember, it's market day. Time to drag yourself through mud, barter with people who definitely overwater their ale, and, if you're lucky, hear something new. Because markets are not just where you buy rotting pears. They are where stories breed, and mutate, and become suspiciously detailed versions of things that never happened. This is the medieval version of social media, sweaty people yelling over chickens. Today's new tale comes from a man who's been to 3 towns away, which basically makes him a world traveler. His teeth are mostly present. His beard is definitely housing some wildlife. And he says, get this, he saw a knight fight a bear. With his bare hands. Pause for groan. Thank you. But seriously, people are eating it up. Is it true? Of course not. The bear probably ran away. Or maybe it was a goat. Maybe there was no knight, just a drunk cobbler with a bucket. Doesn't matter. The story's good. It has drama. It has shouting. It has an ending where someone loses a thumb. All the ingredients of a tale worth repeating. And that's the secret sauce, isn't it? Stories that survive aren't necessarily the best. They're the most retellable. The ones that make your cousin snort barley ale out his nose. The ones that have a rhythm, a hook, a big moment, like when the cow started talking or the well caught fire. Bonus points if it ends with divine punishment or a surprise wedding. And it's not just for entertainment. These stories teach. Sort of. They teach lessons, or at least pretend to. Don't steal, or the river spirits will pull you in. Don't lie, or your tongue will grow a fungus. Don't sleep with the miller's wife, unless you want your chickens to explode. Are these things medically accurate? No. Are they effective? Surprisingly, yes. Because in a world without Google, fear and folklore are your best educators. Now let's take a step outside the muddy borders of your tiny village, which smells like cabbage and regret. Let's travel. Don't worry, you won't need shoes. Just imagination and a very forgiving immune system. Let's start with the Norse. The Norse. Masters of cold weather, strong drink, and storytelling that involves entirely too many decapitations. These people had sagas. Not just stories. Sagas. Long, poetic, complex beasts of narrative filled with revenge, gods, family feuds, and the occasional magical talking tree. Think Game of Thrones, but colder and with more goats. These sagas were memorized and passed down through generations. Entire epics. Recited. Not read. Recited. Because again, writing was expensive, time-consuming, and mostly done by monks who didn't appreciate it when you interrupted them with, "Hey, can you jot down my grandma's romantic escapades with a sea monster?" These oral tales preserved lineage, law, history. They were serious business. If you messed up someone's family saga, you weren't just wrong, you were offensive. Like if someone told your family Thanksgiving story and forgot the part where Uncle Olaf challenged a volcano to a duel. And it wasn't just the Norse. Let's hop down to the Celtic world. Ireland, Wales, Scotland, land of mists, music, and the kind of fairy tales that make modern horror movies look like bedtime stories. These folks had bards too, but they also had filly, professional poets who knew hundreds of stories, trained for years, and could roast you in verse if you looked at them wrong. In Irish society, the filly had the status of nobility. Why? Because they held knowledge, genealogy, myth, legal precedent, weirdly. And they could craft tales that stuck in the mind like a catchy tune or an unresolved argument. Their language was layered with metaphor, rhythm, and the kind of double meanings that made you wonder if they just called your mother a goat. These stories, especially the mythic cycles, like the Ulster cycle or the Fenian cycle, were massive. Heroes like Ku Chulainn, who single-handedly fought armies while having the emotional maturity of a damp carrot. Or Finn MacCumhale, who gained all the world's knowledge by accidentally eating a fish. Classic. The point is, storytelling was status. It wasn't just fun, it was power. If you controlled the story, you shaped how people saw the world. You influenced behavior, memory, reputation. You could make someone a hero or a fool, all with a few well-placed words and dramatic pauses. Now let's detour east. Arabia, the Islamic Golden Age. While much of the world was trying to remember how fire worked, this region was exploding with literature, science, and yes, storytelling. Much of it was oral before it was ever written down. You've probably heard of 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights, a collection of tales that includes Aladdin, Ali Baba, Sinbad, and about 997 others that don't get Disney adaptations. What's beautiful here is how the framed story works. Scheherazade, telling tales every night to delay her execution, spinning cliffhanger after cliffhanger like a medieval soap opera. That's the ultimate example of storytelling as survival. Literal survival. And again, these tales traveled from Persia, India, Arabia, into Europe, across Africa. They changed names, changed locations, changed morals, but the bones of the story stayed. Because they worked. They were gripping. They had structure. And they were adaptable. Like cockroaches. Or medieval bed bugs. Which brings us to something a little messier. Folktales. These were the bottom shelf, people stories. Not epic. Not noble. Just gritty, weird, often slightly inappropriate, and full of poor life choices. Think early versions of Cinderella, where the stepsisters cut off parts of their feet. Or Hansel and Gretel, where the moral is basically don't trust old women with ovens. These were passed along through families, in kitchens, over sewing, while harvesting. These were domestic stories, less about glory and more about survival, danger, trickery, and the occasional haunted kitchen utensil. They taught kids not to wander off, not to eat strangers' food, and to always be suspicious of stepmothers. Folk tales often featured clever peasants. Why? Because that was the only way peasants could win. You didn't have power, but you could have wit. Outthinking the devil. Outsmarting a greedy landlord. Escaping death by pretending to be a goat. That was the medieval dream. And these tales changed. Constantly. They weren't carved in stone. One village might tell the story with a fox. Another with a talking apple. Another with a vaguely French-sounding duck. Whatever made sense in that place, in that moment. The tale was alive, breathing, shifting, and slightly confused. Even among the upper class, storytelling remained vital. Knights, nobles, and courtly people loved a good tale. Especially the romance. Not necessarily romance like smooching under the stars, though there was some of that too. But romance, as in this knight went on a wildly unnecessary quest because a lady dropped her handkerchief and he took it way too seriously. These were tales of honor, loyalty, fighting dragons, which didn't exist, but don't tell them that, and proving oneself worthy. Often by jousting, or composing a poem that didn't make the lady want to claw her ears off. And who told these stories? Sometimes poets. Sometimes minstrels. Sometimes troubadours, those wandering performers from southern France who combined music, poetry, and performance with the subtle art of wooing people way out of their league. Troubadour tales were melodramatic, often badly rhymed, and full of longing. They were, essentially, medieval power ballads. And they worked. Sort of. Enough that some noble women actually ran off with the musicians, which led to even more stories. You can see how this got recursive. Now before we wrap up this chapter, let's not forget the most important part of oral storytelling, the audience. That's you. Not just in the 12th century, sitting by the fire, eating barley porridge that tastes like punishment, but you now, listening, imagining, maybe drifting, maybe falling asleep to the sound of medieval nonsense, and that one cow in the distance that just won't shut up. You're part of the story. Every listener is. Because when a story is told out loud, it's a conversation. Not in words, maybe, but in breath, in memory, in attention, in the rhythm of your pulse matching the cadence of the tale. So if you think you're just here to sleep, you're also here to keep the story alive. Even if you forget half of it by morning. And with that, we let the candle burn low. The storyteller coughs softly, eyes twinkling. The children are snoring. The old man has fallen asleep with his feet in the stew pot. All is well. But tomorrow, there's a new tale. And you're going to want to hear it. You wake up with a jolt. Something's dripping. It's probably from the ceiling. Or your nose. Or a very vengeful ghost. Hard to say at this point. But it's cold and damp. And, oh look, your one blanket has somehow developed a damp corner again, despite never being washed and never going outside. A true medieval miracle. You sit up. You are, once again, not dead, despite consuming exactly 0 vitamins yesterday. You stretch, yawn, and realize it's time for nothing. There's no job interview. No dentist appointment. No checking your emails. Because it's the 13th century, and the only thing on the agenda is not freezing and maybe finding out what happened to your neighbor's missing pig. So you wander outside, and lo, there's a gathering. Not a riot, not a plague funeral, this time. Just your fellow villagers, huddled around an old woman in an aggressively shapeless cloak, her eyes like dried raisins, and her voice like sand scraping against iron. She's a tale spinner, a local legend, and she's about to talk. Now, she doesn't have a script. She doesn't need one. Her stories aren't written anywhere except the weird folds of her brain and maybe one wax-stained sheep bone she occasionally licks for inspiration. She opens her mouth, and out comes a story. No preamble. No like, comment, and subscribe. Although, if she could, she'd probably demand tribute in chickens. So before we go deeper into this, let's pause, just for a moment, to do the equivalent of medieval support for content creators. Take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're actually enjoying this sleepy little history spiral into Storyland. And drop a comment to say where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Seriously, it's weirdly delightful to know who's drifting off in Oslo and who's watching this at 2 a.m. from a mattress that may or may not be made of hay. Okay, back to the crone and her impeccable narrative timing. She starts telling the story of the baker's wife who laughed too loudly. Why? Unclear. Probably a cautionary tale. Maybe just petty revenge. But it involves a goat trial, a spontaneous beehive incident, and someone getting cursed to always smell like soup. The crowd is hooked. You, meanwhile, are fascinated by the fact that this story has rhythm, repetition, a beat. Like poetry, but grungier. Like a medieval version of slam poetry, where the slam was literal and involved 2 sheep and a well. And there's a reason for that. Mnemonics. No, that's not a disease. It's the ancient art of remembering stuff without writing it down by making it rhythmic, repetitive, and weird. This woman doesn't just tell stories, she performs them. There's a pattern to her voice, little phrases she repeats, and so it came to pass, like bookmarks in the chaos. And if she forgets a part, she just makes it up. No one knows. No one cares. Because storytelling isn't about accuracy. It's about flow. Momentum. You stumble, you patch it, you keep going. Like a cart with a broken wheel and too many turnips. And these performers weren't rare. Every culture had them. Some were loved. Some were feared. Some were just weird people who smelled like onions and showed up uninvited. In West Africa, they were called griots, musician historians who were basically walking, singing USB drives of everything from genealogy to royal history to spicy village drama. They used instruments like the kora, a beautiful string thing that looked like someone tried to make a harp out of a melon. Griots were trained from childhood, lived with noble families, and could recite dozens of generations of history. Dozens. You can't even remember your cousin's birthday. These people remembered wars, treaties, scandals. They were the archive, the library, the social media feed, and sometimes the gossip blog, all rolled into one human being with a better memory than you've ever had. And when they told stories, it wasn't just words. It was performance, rhythm, gesture. A griot wasn't just narrating events, they were building emotion, beat by beat. And the audience? Rapt. Because even if you'd heard the tale of Sundiata Keita 100 times, the way this griot told it was different. More sorrow here, more laughter there. Like jazz. But with fewer saxophones and more ancestral pressure. Now let's take a turn toward the Middle East again, because we're not done there. In medieval Baghdad, a city far more sophisticated than your hut with its decorative pile of rat skeletons, storytelling was a profession. Literal street performers, hakawadas, would recite epics in public squares and coffeehouses. Yes, coffee existed. Praise be to the bean gods. These men would memorize hundreds of pages of narrative. They wore dramatic clothes. They used props. They recited tales that sometimes took days to finish. Imagine cliffhangers, but in person. And just as the prince was about to open the cursed chest, pause for dramatic cough, come back tomorrow. You'd riot, but you'd also come back. Because the tale had you. And these hakawadas weren't making things up willy-nilly. No, they were continuing epics that had been passed down for centuries. Sometimes they'd add embellishments. New characters. Spicier subplots. Think fanfiction, but public domain and funded by the local falafel stand. In places like India, we see something similar, Katha performances, where sacred texts and moral tales were narrated aloud, often with music, sometimes dancing. And it wasn't just for fun. It was devotional. Storytelling was prayer, instruction, entertainment, a full-body spiritual experience. You didn't just hear the story, you felt it, from your toes to your coconut oil-coated scalp. And then, of course, we get to puppets. Oh yes, puppets. The medieval multi-tool of oral storytelling. Because sometimes you want to tell a story, but also you don't want people to look directly at your face. Enter the shadow puppet. Especially popular in Southeast Asia and parts of the Islamic world, shadow puppet theater used intricately carved leather figures and a backlit cloth screen to create vivid dramas, often based on epic mythologies like the Ramayana or Mahabharata. Behind the screen was the dalong, the puppeteer, the voice actor, the sound effects person, and the all-around emotional manipulator. These people trained for decades. They could voice 20 characters, improvise jokes, perform with rhythm, and bring an audience to tears with nothing but a flick of the wrist and a screaming wooden monkey. And again, all of it oral. Not written. Not printed. Alive in the moment and then carried away in memory. You could only experience it by being there. Same with Japanese rakugo performers, lone storytellers who sit on a cushion and use only a fan and a hand towel to act out entire multi-character stories. Comedy, tragedy, moral lessons, ghost tales. One person, 1,000 voices. The oral tradition, distilled into a calm, seated explosion of talent. Now, you may be wondering, how did these stories stay consistent? Answer, they didn't. And that's okay. Because the idea of a true version is modern. Medieval stories were like soup recipes. Everyone made their own, passed it on, forgot half the ingredients, replaced the rest with whatever was growing in the yard, and insisted it was the original version from my great-grandfather who totally didn't make it up on the spot. Stories changed with the teller. A heroic tale in one village became a cautionary tale in another. A dragon in one culture was a giant angry bird in the next. The bone stayed, maybe, but the flesh was always fresh, sometimes suspiciously so. And yes, eventually, stories did get written down. Sometimes by monks. Sometimes by bored nobles. Sometimes by travelers who wanted a souvenir that didn't smell like chic. But writing was still limited, fragile, rare. Oral storytelling, on the other hand, was everywhere. Constant, communal, performed. It was not a passive act. It was immersive, active, and sometimes deeply sweaty. And in this world, where most people couldn't read and books were chained to desks like prisoners, the oral tale was not just a luxury. It was how you knew things, how you remembered, how you learned who you were and what your gods wanted, and why you should never, ever follow a cat into the woods after sundown. So now, you're sitting by the hearth again. Your stomach is full of something warm, brown, and probably made of lentils and divine indifference. The tale-spinner's voice is growing slower, softer. She's reaching the end. And you feel it, that moment where the world pulls in close, where the fire crackles just right, where the wind outside pauses like it, too, is listening. And you drift, not just into sleep, but into story. Because here, in the soft medieval dark, without books, without screens, without light, stories shine. Even if they're mostly about goats. You are lying under a damp blanket that smells like someone else's dreams. Probably a shepherd's. Probably fermented. It's nighttime again in the 13th century. You've eaten precisely one turnip, two stale crusts, and what might have been a beetle but could also have been a really crunchy lentil. There's no way to know. No lab tests. Just vibes. You're curled beside the hearth, the fire dying in its own slow medieval way, smoky, sulky, and barely aware of its purpose anymore. Welcome to the golden hour of village storytelling, where entertainment is organic, gluten-free, and usually spoken by someone with no teeth and several opinions. Tonight, the story is coming from a traveling merchant who smells like cloves and regret. He has exactly one working boot and a sack full of objects he claims are from the East. One of them is clearly just a rock. The other might be soap. But his real currency is stories, and people are listening. Now, this man is not trained. He is not a griot, a hakawati, or a certified bard with a harp and an existential crisis. He is just a guy. But that's kind of the point. In the medieval world, everyone was a storyteller. Whether you were trying to explain why your pig went missing, it was the forest spirit, obviously, or exaggerating your part in a minor scuffle, there were at least 6 wolves. Telling stories wasn't optional. It was survival. Because there is no TikTok. There is no news anchor. There is no podcast. Your only options are talk to people or sit silently and count your remaining toes. So you talk. And sometimes, that talking becomes something more. Tonight's tale is about a saint. Though honestly, most medieval saints sounded like hallucinating desert hermits with boundary issues. This one, apparently, tamed a bear, converted a forest, and cried tears of honey. Classic. But the merchant tells it well. He uses gesture, wide, swooping arms to show the bear, tight clutches for the honey tears. He lowers his voice for the sad parts, raises it for the divine ones. He paces. He pauses. He looks around dramatically, like he's about to reveal, you are the reincarnated saint. You are not. You're cold and slightly damp. But the drama is appreciated. Let's zoom out for a second. What this merchant is doing. It's not random. It's not just talking. It's a deeply embedded oral tradition that has been passed down for millennia. And it follows rules. Subtle ones. Psychological ones. Designed to keep you awake and emotionally vulnerable, even though your brain is made of porridge and superstition. Let's break down some of those rules. First, the rule of threes. If you tell a story with 3 trials, 3 brothers, or 3 talking pigs, the human brain goes, yes. This is trustworthy. This has structure. 1 pig? Confusing. 2 pigs? Suspicious. 3 pigs? Instant classic. Second, repetition with variation. The merchant repeats phrases, and lo, the forest wept, but slightly changes what comes next. This isn't just to sound poetic. It's a memory trick. Repetition helps you remember, variation keeps you interested. It's like medieval clickbait, but with more moss. Third, formulaic openings and closings. These weren't just for fun. They were signposts. Long ago, in the days before the towers fell, tells your brain, begin dream sequence. And so, the fields were sown, and peace returned. Means, time to snuff the candle and pray you don't get the midnight plague. But beyond structure, these tales had purpose. They taught values. Not always good ones. Not always consistent ones. But still, values. Like, don't trust wolves. Don't wander into forests alone. Don't marry someone whose eyes change color in candlelight. And if a talking fish offers you wishes, you better be emotionally stable enough to handle disappointment. Because medieval people weren't just being entertained, they were remembering things. In a world without Google, every story was a file folder, where you stored how to act, how to survive, and what to do if a goose starts speaking Latin at you in a dream. Some stories were educational. Others were morality plays in disguise. Some were just weird for fun. Like the one about the man who married a fox that turned into a loaf of bread. Yes, that's real. And no, it doesn't get less confusing. These oral tales weren't just told by professionals. They came from families, passed from grandmother to grandchild like recipes for stew or petty resentment. And every telling changed them slightly, because your uncle might think the princess should run away, while your aunt insists she should become queen and cancel all taxes. Storytelling was a conversation with ghosts, a collaborative, generational improv session, fueled by bread and unresolved trauma. Now, maybe you're wondering, but surely people started writing things down eventually? Yes. Yes, they did. And things got complicated. Because when you take an oral story and write it down, it freezes. The messiness is gone. The local variations die. The spicy metaphors your grandfather used disappear. What you get instead is canon. Official versions. Approved myths. You know who love that? Churches. Because oral stories are unpredictable, and nothing terrifies organized religion like a grandma ad-libbing theology over soup. So monks started transcribing. They wrote things down in cold little cells with cold little fingers, copying the life of St. Mildred or the miraculous cheese of St. Bodolph onto vellum, which is a fancy way of saying a dead sheep that got turned into stationery. These monks preserved a lot. Bless them. But they also cleaned things up. And so many original oral traditions, their humor, their innuendo, their earthy metaphors, got washed away, sanitized, made appropriate. What survived in writing was the polished tip of an iceberg made entirely of filth, rebellion, and emotional chaos. Because what gets remembered depends on who writes it down. And unfortunately, medieval record keepers had the storytelling flair of a wet sponge. But not everything was lost. Because even as written texts appeared, oral storytelling never died. It just adapted. For example, ballads. These were the 14th century equivalent of Taylor Swift albums, but with more murder and fewer lawsuits. Ballads were sung in marketplaces, taverns, alleys. They told stories of knights, betrayals, tragic romances, highwaymen, beheadings, plagues, witch trials, and, occasionally, a cheerful duck. And yes, they rhymed. Because rhymes stick. Rhymes are sticky little memory traps. That's why even today, you probably remember. Ring around the rosy. A pocket full of posies. Congratulations. You've just remembered a medieval plague song disguised as a nursery rhyme. See, oral tradition never dies. It just changes outfits. Now, imagine you're sitting in a medieval tavern. It smells like smoke, onions, mead, and regret. A man stands up with a lute. He sings about a lover who turned into a swan and flew away during tax season. Half the audience cries. The other half sings along. Because they know the words. Ballads traveled across borders. A single melody might pick up new verses in France, drop some in Wales, and gain 3 entirely new plot twists in Scotland. These were living texts. Adaptable. Viral, in the good way. And they weren't always noble. Many ballads were about petty crimes, or political satire, or scandalous affairs between monks and milkmaids. You know, the classics. Then came the mummers, traveling performance troupes who acted out folk plays in public squares and noble courts alike. Their stories were loud, chaotic, and filled with audience participation. Like medieval pantomime. If you've never seen a peasant in a papier-mâché dragon costume try to fight death with a wooden spoon, you've never lived. These mummers told morality tales, folk epics, and anything that could be crammed into a 20-minute performance before someone threw a cabbage. They wore masks, used slapstick, improv'd like their lives depended on it, which sometimes they did, depending on how the local lord felt about being impersonated by a drunk shepherd in leggings. This, too, was storytelling without writing, but with more props. Back in your village, the fire is now embers. The merchant has passed out, face first in a pile of questionable beans. Someone's snoring. Someone else is singing softly about a knight who lost his horse, his hat, and his sense of direction. You lay back, blanket pulled tight. Your body aches from a life without chiropractors, but your mind is humming. Because even though no one here can read, everyone knows a story. And so long as people can speak, they can pass the world along, one tale at a time. Sleep now. The tale will continue in the morning. You wake up with straw in your hair and the vague, itchy memory of dreaming about talking geese. The merchant is gone, disappeared sometime before dawn, probably to the next village over to peddle his discount relics and wax philosophical about swamp spirits. The hearth is cold. Someone's child is crying, but, as was medieval custom, no one is addressing it directly. Maybe they're hoping the crying will just become another story. You shuffle outside. The ground is wet in that medieval kind of way where it's not raining, per se, but everything is still somehow 90% moisture. Your shoes are not helping. They are made of leather, stitched roughly, and they sigh when you walk, as if they're also tired of your life choices. You're headed to the common green, where something magical is happening. No, not actual magic. That's been banned and or burned. But a different kind of sorcery, the fair. Yes, the medieval fair. Is not exactly Coachella, unless Coachella also had pigs on leashes, spoiled ale, and a juggler named Pissrat Allen. But this is peak storytelling territory. Because wherever there are crowds, there are tales to be told. So before we wander deeper into the hay-smelling chaos, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if your spirit isn't yet too crushed by this 3-hour wander through the crumbly soul of human history. And comment below where you're listening from and what ungodly hour you're using this to fall asleep at. Genuinely, it's always strange and delightful to learn who's dozing off in Norway or binging medieval sadness in a New Jersey Taco Bell parking lot. Now then, where were we? Yes, the fair. You're walking past a man selling suspicious meat pies that smell like ambition and regret. He has a sign that says goose. It is clearly not goose. But beside him is something far more interesting, a story booth. Or rather, a crate on which stands a thin woman wearing a pointy hat made of felt, shouting at strangers with a voice that sounds like it's been fermented in cider. She's a teller of fortunes. But she's not really telling fortunes. She's spinning narratives, customized for each passing soul. You with the crooked back, you will cross a river of milk and marry a goat wife, she yells, pointing to a startled Cooper who definitely didn't expect his fate to involve dairy and barnyard matrimony. These performances were more than entertainment. They were a form of interactive storytelling. People came to hear themselves inserted into myth. It was personalized folklore with a light sprinkling of identity theft. But at the fair was the YouTube of medieval oral culture. Then the Village Tavern was its long-running podcast. Every night, it played host to a rotating cast of narrators, veterans, beggars, poets, witches, and the one local man who claims he once arm-wrestled the Pope. He did not. The Pope is very private with his wrists. In these taverns, stories would bounce around like smoke from a fire, exaggerated, fragmented, whispered, sung. You'd hear tales of distant wars you couldn't name, lands you'd never see, and be so implausible they had to be real. A giant with 1 foot and 2 navels. A fish that sang hymns. A kingdom ruled by a cabbage with a crown. People believed these things. Not because they were gullible, but because, without maps, newspapers, or reliable cartography, stories were the truth. If a man from 3 villages over said he saw a ghost in a millstone, who were you to argue? You hadn't even seen 3 villages over. You barely knew how many teeth you had. Now, some of the most compelling stories came from pilgrims. These were not your modern, selfie-taking backpackers. No, these were grimy, sunburnt, God-fearing wanderers who walked hundreds of miles to stare at someone's ankle bone preserved in glass. And they had seen things. Pilgrims were a primary vector for oral storytelling across Europe. They would start a story in Flanders and finish it in Florence. Along the way, they'd pick up new plot points, local characters, fresh metaphors, and sometimes a rash. Pilgrim stories traveled faster than disease, and with just as much distortion. But they created shared cultural myths that transcended language, class, and hygiene standards. One of the best-preserved pilgrim tale collections? Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which, spoiler alert, are basically just a bunch of people trying to out-weird each other on the road to a shrine. But even Chaucer was doing what everyone else was doing, listening, remixing, and retelling. Sometimes these tales were coded social commentary. If you couldn't publicly criticize your lord, you'd just tell a story about a lion who hoarded all the grain and mysteriously fell off a cliff. Totally unrelated. Oral storytelling was the Twitter of the Middle Ages, if Twitter were spoken by toothless farmers and filtered through 18 layers of allegory. Another fascinating storytelling form? Dream visions. These were stories people claimed to have dreamed, often involving angelic beings, talking animals, or metaphysical shopping trips through the afterlife. You wake up from a fever, probably caused by eating whatever that pie was, and announce, "Last night I dreamed of a silver bridge, where each soul had to pay a toll in tears, and the ferryman was a duck." Congratulations. That's a medieval story now. And probably a sermon. People loved dream stories. They were considered divine messages, or at least spiritual nudges. Sometimes they were passed on and polished until they sounded like scripture. Other times, they were weird little footnotes in someone's diary, preserved for eternity in a monastery library that later caught fire. Still, they mattered. And now, we take a moment to talk about something called kennings. Imagine you're trying to say ocean, but you're a Viking poet and you refuse to use such plebeian terminology. So instead, you call it the whale road. That's a kenning, a metaphor compressed into a compound noun. Fire becomes sky's candle. Blood becomes battle sweat. Your landlord becomes rent devil. These poetic constructions were part of the oral tradition, especially in the Norse and Anglo-Saxon worlds, where actual writing was rare and public performance was everything. You didn't just tell a story. You crafted it in real time, using rhythm, wordplay, and strategic alliteration. The more clever your phrasing, the more likely your tale was to be remembered, or at least not immediately booed by the local warlord. Let's also not forget gesture-based storytelling, particularly among the illiterate or deaf. Monks, for instance, developed intricate sign systems so they could maintain their vows of silence while still gossiping about Brother Ethelwulf's suspiciously long trips to the orchard. But even outside the cloister, people relied on their hands, their eyes, their posture. A hunchback and a frown might be old crone. A raised fist and a limp might be drunken night. These movements became visual shorthand, like interpretive dance, but with more injuries. Now you may be wondering, how did these stories survive? Why do we still know them? Enter collectors, often aristocrats or clergy who thought, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we wrote down what peasants think happens when you whistle at midnight in a bog? These early folklorists, though they didn't call themselves that, tried to preserve oral traditions, usually while slightly mocking them. But in doing so, they saved entire worlds of imagination that might otherwise have vanished. Still, not everything got written. Most of what existed in the oral world vanished, like breath and cold air. That's the great paradox of storytelling without writing. It's alive, but it's also doomed to die. Every telling is unique, every version personal, and every story fades unless passed on. Like your grandma's recipe for soup that required just enough salt to remember your sins. Yet here you are, hundreds of years later, listening, imagining, maybe even dozing off to the murmur of tales told by candlelight over ale and mud and the relentless squeaking of badly made shoes. Because this, what we're doing now, is the modern version of that same tradition. You're not just hearing a story. You're part of its memory. You're keeping it alive, even if you don't remember the details when you wake up. So sleep, for now. Dream of saints with honey tears, of fish who sing, of pilgrims walking toward relics they don't understand, with stories they're not finished telling. We'll pick it up again when the fire's hot and the moon is nosy. You wake up in a barn. Again. This is starting to become a pattern. The air smells like moldy straw and something that might once have been a goat or might still be a goat, but it's hard to tell. Your blanket is a burlap sack that previously held turnips. It still holds turnip energy. You are, at this point, at peace with your dignity, having left you sometime around chapter 3. The fire's out, but there's a faint warmth still lingering in the ashes, like a bedtime story that ended halfway through and just decided not to explain what happened to the villain. It's early morning, and outside, the world is gray and damp. You're not quite ready to face another day of patchy meals and peasant eye contact, but someone in the village has started banging pots together to wake everyone up for prayer or sheep-related tasks, which are, tragically, the only two events on today's calendar. There's no TikTok, no Netflix, no content waiting for you other than the crows, the drizzle, and a woman named Esmelda who claims she's 114 and once danced with a mun who turned into mist. And yet somehow, you're still entertained. Because, like every medieval human across thousands of years of aching backs and bad shoes, you live in a world where stories are all you have. Today, you're going to follow one of the strangest types of storytellers, the minstrel, or jongler, or gleeman, depending on your location and how much French influence your region has suffered recently. These folks are like the wandering bards of your fantasy novels, except dirtier, drunker, and significantly more likely to be paid in bread crusts or a stern nod of approval. They show up in towns like yours with a lute, a dusty dog, and an energy that suggests both poetry and public urination. They don't have a PowerPoint. They don't have a script. What they do have is a handful of songs, half-true tales, and the unshakable confidence of someone who once rhymed dragon with wagon in front of a duke and didn't die. So you follow one, let's call him Bartholomew, because of course you do. Bartholomew of somewhere. Last name unknown. His clothes are patched in 17 places and smell like a cheese that lost its will to live. He has a harp, a flute, and a face that suggests he once ate a manuscript just to spite a monk. He begins his tale standing on a barrel outside the alehouse, performing a tragic story of love, betrayal, and a pig that wouldn't stay dead. The crowd leans in, because this isn't just entertainment. It's history, it's news, and it's therapy. Bartholomew weaves the tale using rhyme, repetition, and alliteration, tools that make stories easier to memorize and perform. After all, he's carrying all these stories in his head. No books, no scrolls, just brainpire, wine, and the occasional hallucination. You watch as the villagers start to mouth along with certain parts. They've heard this one before. And that's the point. These stories are communal. They are meant to be remembered, repeated, and reshaped over time. No two performances are ever quite the same. It's like open mic night, except the mic is a stick, and the audience is made of people who've only ever seen 3 plays in their entire lives and consider sheep theft an acceptable icebreaker. And if you think that sounds romantic, remember, the life of a minstrel was miserable. They were wanderers, social outcasts, no fixed home, constantly dodging taxes, bandits, and jealous husbands. They were often hired by nobles to perform flattering tales of family heroism and fired the moment they got too creative. But for all that, they were vital. Without them, entire chunks of history, legend, and satire would have vanished. Because while monks wrote in Latin and nobles funded scribes, it was the minstrels who told the stories that mattered to everyone else. They were the YouTubers, the podcasters, the TikTok historians of their day, except with fewer sponsorships and more fleas. And then there were the mummers. Imagine a group of people who show up in masks, perform a chaotic play in someone's yard, possibly threaten the chickens, and then leave in a hail of applause, confusion, and possibly apples. That's a mummer's play. Usually performed around holidays, especially Christmas and midsummer, mummers told simple moral tales full of death, resurrection, and badly acted sword fights. There's always a villain. There's always a hero. Someone definitely dies. Then someone else definitely brings them back to life with a magical doctor character who may or may not be drunk. The costumes are terrifying. The plot makes no sense. The audience is delighted. And the actors? They're usually locals in disguise. It's community theater meets fever dream. Some historians think mummers' plays are descendants of pagan rituals. Others think they were just an excuse to yell in public. Both things can be true. Still, these plays kept certain characters alive for centuries. St. George, the Turkish knight, Beelzebub with his club. These names would have been recognized across regions because they were part of the shared oral canon. Not written down, just passed, performer to performer, often father to son, like an heirloom you can scream. Meanwhile, in the upper echelons of society, storytelling was happening in different ways. Nobles loved romances. Not like your modern rom-coms. These were sprawling, dramatic tales full of knights, quests, damsels, dragons, symbolic deer, mysterious forests, and usually somebody committing unintentional incest. These stories were often read aloud by someone literate, usually a servant, to an audience of nobles who couldn't be bothered to learn reading themselves. The room would be dimly lit, the furniture uncomfortable, and someone would inevitably fall asleep halfway through the third jousting monologue. But the stories stuck. And they weren't just told, they were sung. Because poetry and music were often one and the same. Think less Shakespeare and more power ballad about a guy who died of love poisoning and came back as a ghost made of bees. Music gave structure to memory. It's easier to remember a verse than a page. Easier to chant a name than to write it. And once again, the rhythm is everything. Like medieval karaoke, except your instrument is a hurdy-gurdy and the lyrics are about vengeance and divine punishment. It's at this point in the day that you find yourself wandering away from the village into a nearby field where a shepherd is talking to his sheep. Not in a creepy way, in a narrative way. Because even shepherds, especially shepherds, had stories. They spent hours alone in the hills, watching woolly creatures do absolutely nothing of note. And so, to keep themselves sane, they'd tell tales aloud. Sometimes to each other. Sometimes to the sheep. Often, to themselves. Some of those tales made their way into pastoral poetry, full of idealized countryside nonsense. Other stories stayed rough and strange, like the one about the sheep that glowed at night and led a boy to a buried chalice. Spoiler, it was a soup bowl, and the boy had a concussion. But the important thing is that everyone, no matter their station, was part of this oral universe. You didn't need a book. You just needed a voice, an audience, and a willingness to make things up while hoping no one fact-check you. You sit by a rock and listen to the shepherd mumble about a storm that happened 5 years ago, and how it blew a wind so hard it carried away his uncle's house. There's probably some truth to it. Maybe not the flying house part. But who cares? Because this is what stories do. They fill the gaps. They stitch together facts and dreams. They carry us through cold nights and long walks and plague years. They help us make sense of a world that has none. And somewhere, deep in the woods, a child is telling a fairy tale she half remembers, about a tree that sings and a woman made of fireflies. Her brother interrupts to say fireflies don't make women. She hits him with a stick. A new story is born. It's messy. It's alive. It's fading even as it forms. And yet, somehow, it endures. You wake up face first in a patch of wet moss. It tastes like sadness, mold, and mild regret. There's a twig in your ear. Your clothes are damp. You don't remember how you got here, but that's been a running theme for about 6 chapters now. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster screams, not crows, screams, because this is a rooster that has seen things and doesn't believe in subtlety. You sit up slowly, bones creaking like a wooden ship full of ungrateful rats. Your back is stiff. Your breath fogs in the cool morning air. A beetle scurries across your foot and makes a sound that might have been a curse word. And once again, you realize it's time for another story. But this time, not from a minstrel or a shepherd. No flutes. No mystery pigs. No sword-wielding mummers in terrifying homemade masks. Today, you're going somewhere more exclusive. Somewhere less sweaty. You're headed to the court. A medieval court, as it turns out, is not the glamorous fantasy world of gowns, feasts, and glittering chandeliers. It's more like a badly lit banquet hall full of rich people pretending not to notice how cold they are. There's mud on the floor, dogs under the table, and someone is already drunk even though it's still morning. And here, stories aren't just entertainment. They're currency. The nobles are bored. They've hunted every animal that moves, executed most of the people they don't like, and written love poetry so bad that even the horses have started avoiding them. So they need something to pass the time. That's where the court poet comes in. Now, the term poet might conjure an image of someone gentle and sensitive, staring wistfully at a sunset. But in reality, your average medieval court poet was more like a mix between a historian, a propagandist, and a hype man with a very sharp memory. They told epics. Long, dramatic, rhyme tales of noble ancestors who definitely didn't wet themselves in battle. These stories served a purpose, to glorify the present by pretending the past was much more impressive than it actually was. You sit cross-legged on the floor beside a wine cask that may or may not have gone sentient. A hush falls over the room. The poet begins. Their voice is deep, rhythmic, and utterly humorless. They launch into a tale of Sir Ethelwald the Unflinching, who once fought 12 Danes at once, killed a bear with his elbow, and only cried twice in his life, once at his mother's funeral, and once when he stepped on a pine cone barefoot. The audience is entranced. But you? You notice something. The rhythm. The structure. The use of formulaic phrases, like brave beyond measure or his sword sang in his hand. These aren't just for flair. They're mnemonic devices, tools to help the poet remember what comes next. Because this isn't being read from a scroll. This is being performed from memory. The oral tradition thrives here, not despite the wealth, but because of it. Books are expensive. Literacy is rare. And yet stories are still vital. Not just for fun, but for legacy, reputation, power. The poet finishes with a flourish. The nobles nod solemnly. Someone throws a roasted partridge leg in appreciation. You're pretty sure the dog gets it before the poet does. But no matter. Because now it's time for the real MVPs of oral tradition, the women. You see, while history loves to focus on monks and poets and wandering men with lutes, a huge amount of storytelling happened quietly, at home, passed from grandmother to child, sister to sister, across kitchens and hearts and fields full of cabbages. These stories weren't about glory. They were about monsters, warnings, morals. You spend the next evening inside a low cottage. There are 5 people crammed into a space the size of a modern pantry. The fire flickers. The stew smells like onions and ambition. And as the wind howls outside, an old woman begins a story. It's about a girl who gets lost in the woods, meets a creature with backwards feet, and survives only by giving it a riddle so confusing it forgets how to eat her. You don't know if it's true. You don't care. Because the cadence, the voice, the dark humor, it's hypnotic. These are folk tales. Tales that weren't written down until much later, if at all. Tales full of talking animals, enchanted wells, and consequences that make modern fairy tales look like mild disappointments. You want to eat a forbidden cake? Boom. You're a snail for the rest of eternity. And the people telling these tales weren't professional storytellers. They were mothers, daughters, aunts. Working-class women with callous hands and sharp minds. They remembered. They adapted. They shaped stories to fit the mood, the audience, the moment. This is where oral tradition becomes survival. Because stories aren't just about entertainment. They're about transmission, lessons, identity, warnings wrapped in wonder. A memory passed down through generations because it might keep a child from stepping on the wrong toad. You're told that in the next village over, there's a woman who can recite 20 variations of the same story about a cursed comb. Each version is different. Some have ghosts. Some have singing teeth. One features a mun who gets turned into a turnip because he insulted a duck. You don't ask questions. You just listen. And all around you, people keep telling stories. Around fires. In fields. At weddings. During funerals. At markets. Even at executions. Especially at executions, which tend to be the medieval equivalent of season finales. It's not just the content that matters. It's the act of storytelling. The performance. The voice. The rhythm. The ritual. Even the chants you hear at the local abbey have stories. Chanted prayers, hymns, psalms, these are all ways to encode memory into sound. Because when you can't write, you sing. You repeat. You make it impossible to forget. You fall asleep that night to the sound of a lullaby. It's in a dialect you don't understand, sung by a woman with a voice like warm wool and old bread. The melody loops gently. The rhythm settles into your spine. It doesn't matter what the words mean. The story is doing its job. And as you drift off, you think to yourself, this is how history survived. Not through parchment. Not through ink. But through the mouths of people who remembered. People who believed. People who knew that words spoken in the dark are sometimes stronger than words etched in stone. If you're still with me, congratulations. You've survived another chapter of medieval oral storytelling without Wi-Fi, power, or a decent mattress. You wake up under a cart. Again. At this point, you've accepted that beds are a myth invented by nobles and your spinal alignment is being actively punished by some kind of petty mattress deity. There's a suspicious chicken staring at you. You stare back. It blinks first. Victory is yours. The cart smells like dried fish, spilled beer, and a man named Reginald who once fought a tree and lost. You crawl out slowly, dust yourself off, and remember that today is a market day. Which means crowds. And crowds mean stories. But this time, not from the mouths of minstrels or noble poets, or even terrifying mummers with papier-mâché faces and identity crises. No, today's stories come from the people around you. Traders, hawkers, beggars, blacksmiths, butchers, children covered in jam, each one buzzing with a tale they can't wait to yell at someone. Because here's a thing medieval people understood better than modern humans, scrolling through 19 open tabs on their phone. A story is only alive when it's shared. And markets? Markets were where stories went to dance. You wander through the crowd, dodging a goat with too much self-esteem and a man selling miracle beans that are, if you're being honest, just small rocks painted green. But it doesn't matter. Because what he's selling isn't the bean, it's the story behind it. He tells anyone who'll listen about how the beans were blessed by a saint. Or a wizard. Or maybe a wizard saint named Saint Gerald the Explosive. He changes the story depending on who he's talking to. That's the trick. That's the game. This isn't lying. It's storytelling. There's a difference. Lying gets you thrown out. Storytelling gets you a second bowl of stew and a place to sleep next to someone who may or may not be a retired highwayman. So before we dive deeper, take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you like falling asleep to deeply unsexy history whispered through jokes and damp metaphors. And drop a comment with your location and time, because it's genuinely fascinating to see who else is lying awake at 2:37 a.m. wondering if medieval peasants had knock-knock jokes. Now, back to the market. There's a woman selling herbs and dried roots who also sells spells, which are really just little rhymes passed down from her grandmother, wrapped in linen and soaked in vinegar. People buy them not just for the herbs, but for the little stories that come with them. This one, she says, will keep your dreams clean. Burn it on Tuesdays under a full moon. Or don't. The moon's gonna do what it wants anyway. It's charming. It's nonsense. And it's oral culture at its finest. Because oral storytelling in the medieval world wasn't always formal. It wasn't always performed on a stage or by a person wearing feathers and shouting, "Behold." Sometimes, it was just everyday people sharing anecdotes, jokes, riddles, superstitions, or wildly inaccurate gossip over firewood and fermented fish. Even the insults had structure. The local children are currently playing a game where they try to out-insult each other using phrases like "your cow milks dust" or "you smell like a cursed duck's final thoughts." One kid wins by simply yelling "you're from Norfolk" and running away. No one questions it. Norfolk must have done something. This is how people pass time. Oral storytelling was embedded in everything, from jokes to work songs to courtship rituals. Because without radio, books, podcasts, or Netflix specials hosted by sarcastic British men, you are the entertainment. And if you can't be entertaining, you'd better at least know a story that is. You pass a blacksmith who tells you about a sword he once made that shattered in battle and somehow turned into a cloud. You nod solemnly. You both know it didn't happen. But you also both want it to be true. That's the beauty of a good tale. It doesn't have to be real. It just has to be retold. And don't forget the riddles. Riddles were huge, especially in Anglo-Saxon and Norse cultures. They were used for fun, flirtation, education, and mild threats. You hear one now from a very old man with suspiciously good teeth. "I'm always hungry. I must always be fed. The finger I touch will soon turn red. What am I?" You think about it. You guess angry toddler. He laughs like a dying accordion and says, "Close. Fire." The correct answer doesn't even matter. It's the ritual of asking, thinking, guessing. This is a social bond, a spark, a small performance you can carry in your mouth. You spend part of the afternoon sitting near the edge of the square where a blind man is telling the story of a battle that never happened, on a hill that may not exist, involving heroes whose names change every 10 minutes. He tells it slowly, with pauses where the crowd leans in. You notice people mouthing parts along with him. They've heard it before. They want to hear it again, because repetition is comfort. Oral storytelling in the medieval world wasn't just about passing on information. It was about building a shared memory, a collective hallucination of what the world was, or could be, or maybe just should be. This is how people made sense of plagues and famines and wars and weird weather patterns that made their goat scream in German. They told stories about angry sky giants, vengeful saints, cursed wells, and a ghost dog that only barked on Tuesdays. Were they true? Who knows? Were they useful? Absolutely. Because they gave people a way to explain the unexplainable. When your crops failed, you could either cry or believe that a fox spirit offended the barley gods. And you could tell that story. And in telling it, make the world seem a little less random. You hear another tale from a trader, one who swears he once sailed to a land where the trees whispered poetry and the rivers ran backwards. He tells the tale in 3 languages and pantomimes the trees with jazz hands. It's absurd. It's mesmerizing. It's also probably the highlight of your month. This man is a merchant, but he's also a bard. A salesman, yes, but of stories more than goods. And if you think about it, most jobs in the medieval world had a storytelling component. The carpenter tells stories about how a beam once groaned like a dying night. The brewer says the yeast sings in her sleep. The midwife tells a joke about a baby born holding a chicken. The chicken never recovered. Storytelling is how you pass time, how you process loss, how you entertain, educate, and occasionally warn. Because oral storytelling was also the primary method for passing on laws, lineages, and land rights. If someone in your village says your grandfather gave him permission to graze sheep on your land, and you say he absolutely didn't, Guess what settles it? Not a signed document. A story. A memory. And whichever one sounds more convincing. That's the terrifying power of oral tradition. It's fluid. It changes. But it also sticks. Because the human brain is a sponge for narrative. Give it rhythm, stakes, and a weird animal, and it'll remember a tale for generations. You walk home as the market quiets, head full of half-truths and quarter lies. You're not sure which stories were real, but you're sure they were true. In the way that matters. You fall asleep beside a fire someone else started. You're not sure whose house this is. You don't care. In the fading firelight, someone hums a tune about a knight who turned into a fish to escape marriage. You close your eyes. Because once again, the story is doing its job. You wake up with hay in your mouth. This is becoming a theme. Not the fresh, golden, storybook kind of hay. No, this is the scratchy, half-fermented, suspiciously moist kind of hay that smells like a sheep's armpit and a monastery latrine had an argument. It stuck to your sleeve. Your hair. Probably your soul. You blink at the rafters above you, old wooden beams warped by time, dust, and someone's bad choices involving firewood and fermented turnips. A chicken hops past your face. You don't know where you are. Again. But don't worry. You're exactly where you need to be. Because today's story isn't about courts or marketplaces or shepherds lying about dragons. No. Today, we go deep. Into the murky, humming, incense-choked world of monasteries. Yes, you've somehow wandered into a Benedictine abbey, which is only slightly less confusing than IKEA, but with fewer arrows and more Latin chanting. And here, storytelling takes a very different form, because monks were the lucky few who could write. But did they tell stories without writing? Absolutely. In fact, most of their storytelling, like their shoes, was surprisingly low-tech. But before we start whispering our way through a cloister of mystery and mildew, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to history narrated by someone who clearly needs more vitamin D. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's oddly comforting to know who else is lying in bed at 1:14 a.m., wondering whether monks ever made fart jokes. Spoiler, they did. Okay, let's get medieval. Monastically, you shuffle quietly into the abbey church, feet echoing on stone. It's dark. Always dark. Not romantic candlelight dark, but I can't tell if this is a holy relic or a squirrel dark. Monks didn't light spaces for ambience. Candles were expensive, and daylight was free, allegedly. So you stumble your way to a corner and sit. You're not allowed to talk, or sneeze, or blink too aggressively. But you can listen. And what you hear is chanting. Not the melodic kind you'd hear at a Broadway play. This is Gregorian chant, sung slowly, in Latin, by men who haven't had a nap in 15 years. It drones. It flows. It wraps around your brain like warm soup and holy disappointment. But listen closely, and here's the trick, because this chanting is a story. It's scripture, psalms, prayers, memorized and passed down in melodies designed to stick like spiritual Velcro. These weren't just songs, they were mnemonic devices, perfectly tuned to help people remember long texts without reading them. And let's be clear, most monks couldn't read silently. That wasn't a thing yet. Reading was an out-loud activity. So even when they were alone, the words came out in whispers. Which means the walls of a medieval monastery echoed with the sound of ghostly mumbling 24/7. It was like living inside a very religious beehive. And then, of course, there were the sermons. You're now seated on a bench shaped like a torture device, and a monk is delivering a sermon so slow, it might have started last week. But this isn't just theological lecture. No, this is theater. Monks had to spice it up. They included stories, parables, local legends about demons that danced on rooftops, or saints who turned into deer, or villagers who got punished for cooking meat during Lent and were turned into snails. There was one about a man who skipped mass to chase a squirrel and got swallowed by the earth. That one's used a lot. These sermons were full of symbolism and morality tales, the medieval equivalent of horror movies with a message, except instead of being chased by a mass killer, you're being stalked by eternal damnation and the vague scent of cabbage. You shift uncomfortably on your wooden bench, wondering how anyone sat through these regularly without their butt bones. disintegrating? The answer, of course, is they didn't. People fell asleep. A lot. Monks would literally record complaints about brothers snoring through Vespers. That's not speculation. That's in the records. Even the monks were human. Now, here's something you probably didn't expect: monastic plays. Yes, plays. Liturgical drama was a real thing. Starting around the 10th century, monasteries started staging religious performances. They acted out scenes from the Bible: the resurrection, the nativity, the harrowing of hell, which sounds like a metal band, but is actually the part where Jesus breaks into hell like an ancient John Wick and frees all the good souls. These plays weren't elaborate Broadway numbers. No jazz hands. No stage lights. But they had costumes, singing, and even special effects, like candles hidden inside fake tombs to simulate holy light. You sit in the back, next to a boy holding a papier-mâché angel that looks like it's seen things. A monk playing Jesus just rose from a stone platform using ropes and an extremely determined novice. There's incense. There's chanting. There's a guy in a goat mask representing Satan, and he's surprisingly committed to the role. This is storytelling, with everything they've got. And it wasn't just for fun. It was didactic. A word that sounds fancy but just means annoyingly educational. These plays taught people about salvation, sin, and why you probably shouldn't marry your cousin even if she's only mildly related. Later, these liturgical dramas would evolve into morality plays, performed outside of monasteries by laypeople with even less acting experience but more enthusiasm. You'd have characters like everyman and greed and drunkenness all talking in riddles about the human soul. It was subtle as a shovel to the face. But it worked. Back in the cloister, another form of storytelling emerges: visual. Because even though books existed, they were rare, expensive, and often written in languages most people didn't understand. So monasteries told stories through images. Stained glass, wall paintings, illuminated manuscripts with pictures so chaotic they look like medieval fever dreams. You see a scene of a saint getting beheaded while smiling peacefully, a demon biting a bishop's foot, a unicorn kneeling before the Virgin Mary. You ask what it means. The monk shrugs. Depends on the artist. He was having a moment. These visual stories were meant to guide people through biblical history, especially those who couldn't read. Which was, well, most people. You wander through the scriptorium, where monks copy texts by hand. It's quiet except for the scratching of quills and the occasional sigh of eternal regret. You lean over one monk's shoulder and see that he's added a tiny doodle of a rabbit jousting a snail. This is not a joke. Marginalia, those weird, whimsical illustrations in the margins of medieval manuscripts, were a thing. And nobody knows why they're there. Some scholars think they're jokes. Others think they're visual shorthand for ideas. One theory suggests monks were just really bored and had access to way too much ink. Either way, the result is that some of the most absurd, hilarious storytelling in the medieval world happened in the margins. Literal marginal storytelling. A pig playing the bagpipes. A nun picking phallic fruit. A monkey riding a dog while carrying a sword in its teeth. You can't make this up. Actually, someone did. And they were probably wearing a robe. This is how stories survive, even in the most unlikely places. Even in the quietest corners. As the bells toll for Compline, the final prayer of the day, you feel the walls close in around you like velvet. The chants begin again. You're seated beside a man who hasn't spoken since last Tuesday and may not even be real. The room is cold. Your knees hurt. Your soul smells faintly of candle wax. And yet, you feel calm. Because once again, the story is doing its job. Passing time. Teaching. Entertaining. Whispering ancient truths across centuries of dust and chanting. You close your eyes. And you sleep. You wake up to the sound of bells. Not gentle, ethereal bells. No. These are large, metal, holy frying pans being swung with the enthusiasm of a caffeinated monk. They shake the rafters, rattle your teeth, and announce to every living creature within 3 counties that it's time to wake up and feel guilty. You roll over. You are not ready to be conscious yet. But medieval life doesn't care about your sleep schedule, your feelings, or the fact that you accidentally used a hymn book as a pillow. It's time for another day. Today, however, you're not waking up in a monastery or under a merchant's cart or in a barn that smells like goat rebellion. No. Today, you're in a village. A nice one by medieval standards. Which means it only has a 60% chance of plague and a manageable rat population. You shuffle outside, dodging someone dumping a bucket of what was definitely last night's dinner. And you're greeted by the usual morning smells: smoke, mud, a hint of horse betrayal, and bread that's mostly crust and regret. But amidst all this mess is a flicker of something special. A story is about to be told. Because it's festival day. And that means storytelling in its purest, weirdest, most chaotic form: folk traditions. Now, before we dive headfirst into a crowd of flower-crowned children and mildly intoxicated maypole dancers, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Unless you're just here for the sleep, then keep lying down and pretending you're listening. And comment where you're watching from and what time it is. Because nothing says relaxing evening like ancient stories told by someone who sounds like they haven't seen daylight in 2 weeks. Okay, back to the chaos. You see them gathering at the village green. People in mismatched clothes, painted faces, feathers, bells, horns, and enough ale to turn a sheep into a philosopher. At the center, there's a man dressed as a tree. Not carrying a tree. He is the tree. He's the green man, an ancient symbol of rebirth, spring, vegetation, and the belief that if you dance hard enough while holding onions, crops will grow better. It's weird. It's pagan. And it's somehow still tolerated by the local priest, who is currently 3 meads in and pretending not to see it. This is storytelling through ritual. Before writing, before books, before Instagram reels explaining what an eclipse is, people pass down stories through festivals, dances, symbolic actions, seasonal performances that retold the world as it moved through the year. Winter festivals, for example, weren't just an excuse to drink yourself warm. They were stories reenacted of death, hibernation, and eventual rebirth. Summer festivals celebrated fertility, light, and the annual gamble known as "Will the wheat grow this time?" Every part of the celebration was narrative. The costumes? Symbolic. The dances? Storytelling through motion. The food? Allegorical, if you squint hard enough and ignore the mold. Right now, in front of you, a group of villagers are performing a mumming play, a chaotic, semi-improvised piece of folk theater involving a hero, a villain, a doctor, and someone in a questionable animal costume. No one really knows the script. It changes every time. But here's the gist. A noble figure fights a villain. The noble dies. A comically bad doctor brings him back to life using herbs, usually a leek or a spoonful of beer, and everyone sings. The play ends with a warning about morality, or the price of pride, or just a reminder that death is reversible if you're loud enough. It's folk wisdom, wrapped in silliness, shouted through a sheepskin mask. You clap. Because it's the polite thing to do. And because you're genuinely impressed that the man playing the doctor made it through his lines without falling into the fire pit. The crowd loves it. Children are laughing. The old women are smirking. Someone in the back is vomiting discreetly. Tradition. These folk stories weren't written down. They were passed on through doing. And like most medieval stories, they mutated. The tale of St. George and the Dragon, for example, existed in dozens of forms, some where George is a knight, others where he's a farmer, a priest, a drunk, or a literal onion. The only consistent element? A dragon. And violence. Because if there's one thing medieval people knew, it's that a good story needs 2 things. Something to fight. Something to fear. Even the most joyful village festival had a touch of dread. A whisper of danger. The stories told were not just fun, they were protective. You'll hear an old woman mutter a charm against the night spirits. A father scolds his child with tales of the cornfield man, a figure who steals lazy children at dusk and replaces them with sacks of turnips. Children laugh nervously. But they remember. Oh, they remember. These stories served a purpose. Don't wander off, don't break the rules, don't anger the moon. Some villagers gather for riddle games next. You sit among them, basking in the quiet joy of language being stretched and twisted like a poorly made pie crust. Riddles, like stories, test your cleverness. I fly forever, rest never, have no lungs and no mouth, but I live on wind. What am I? A voice answers, a gossip. Technically, the answer was echo, but honestly, both are valid. Next comes the storytelling circle. No props. No costumes. Just people taking turns. One tells of a man who turned into a wolf by drinking river water at midnight. Another shares a tale about a ghost trapped in a jug of vinegar. One old man insists that he once met death in a forest and traded him a toe for 5 more years. He lifts his foot. Sure enough, he's missing a toe. Coincidence? Probably. Effective? Absolutely. And as each story unfolds, you realize something. Nobody cares if it's true. They care that it's good, that it sticks in your brain like splinters in a wooden spoon, that you carry it forward, repeat it, add to it. Because that's how oral tradition works. You don't memorize a story. You inherit it. You wear it for a while, then pass it on to someone else, slightly altered. A bit more dramatic. A bit more funny. A bit more yours. It's the world's oldest game of historical telephone. And somehow, it works. As the sun sets, the villagers light a bonfire. Not the cozy, Pinterest kind of fire, but the towering, slightly terrifying kind that whispers safety regulations haven't been invented yet. People gather. Sit. Hum. Drink. The local bard, which is really just a guy with 3 teeth and a lute made from someone's old shoe, starts to play. He sings a song about a lady who turned into a swan to escape marriage, and how the moon chased her across 5 kingdoms only to discover she was better at flying. It's poetic. It's funny. It's weirdly empowering. This is what medieval storytelling looked like. Not always grand. Not always noble. But always alive. You watch as children chase shadows, old folks mumble corrections to the bard's lyrics, and a woman stands to tell a tale of a haunted loaf of bread that made her uncle speak only in rhymes. You don't question it. You just listen. Because that's what people did. No writing. No books. No streaming services. Just stories. Told. Retold. Misremembered. Exaggerated. Embellished. Believed. And somehow, more powerful than anything scribbled on parchment. You lie back on the grass. The fire crackles. The stars appear. Someone whispers a story about how the constellations were carved by angels using silver knives. You close your eyes. You believe it, just a little. Because once again, the story is doing its job.